That, but would you tell us, please, a little bit about your background? And you have dual citizenship. Maybe you can just give us a little headline about why and how.
It's a little thing, but I'm kind of proud of it. I'm a British and American citizen, and I just found out this week, this is why I'm excited about it, just found out this week that all of my kids are British citizens. I didn't know that I could pass it on to my kids. And my daughter is in London getting her master's in art history right now, and she wants to stay, and staying as an American would have been difficult to get an employer to sponsor her, so she is like over the moon right now that she has at least a chance to stay. So.
That's awesome. And your name Kroes is not German,
It originally came from Germany and then got modified a little bit in the Netherlands. So it's a Dutch name, and if you were Dutch, you would say Kroes or something like that. I can't roll my R's very
awesome.
well.
Okay. So your mother from Germany, your father American serviceman, met in Germany. You were born in England, but you actually grew up in
From the age of 5, we were in California.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so growing up in California, I think eventually you were raised by a single mom.
Yes.
And so you went to school, college at BYU.
I started out at a community college studying photography, and then came to BYU, eventually studied economics at BYU.
Okay, so why the interest in economics?
It kind of evolved over time. I started out as a sort of generic business management major, and then considered organizational behavior and accounting, and took some courses and learned some interesting stuff. And did a couple of internships. And I always tell kids internships are the best thing you can do. And a couple of internships in corporate finance, one for a very small company, one for a mid-sized company. And found out that I could do that, and I liked the people, but it wasn't feeding my soul. So I just decided at that point I was going to go into a master's degree in something that had more of a public emphasis. Over time, I realized that that would be a Master of Public Administration. That's the direction I decided to go. And economics was just a good prep. If I changed my mind and wanted to get an MBA, economics would have been ideal. And there were a number of things I could have done with that econ degree.
Okay, so MPA. Where did you get your MPA?
Went to the University of Southern California.
Okay.
And so I grew up in Northern California, but at least Southern California was a place that I'd always wanted to experience. And it was fun being down there, and a lot of traffic, but wonderful beaches and wonderful weather.
And knowing you, I know how much you love nature and gardening. There must have been something as a child that really sparked your interest in that.
Yeah, it was my mother. I mean, she was a gardener. And so I remember, I think the moment of empowerment, and it's something I try to remember as a parent. We moved into a new house. It didn't have a front yard. And she called me Stevie. Hey, Stevie, let's plant some flowers and let's plant some trees. She let me pick out the trees, and she let me decide where the flower bed was going to go. And I had it cut directly across the lawn in a big curve. And we planted the flowers together, and that was the beginning of my love for gardening. And she had me help her out in the vegetable garden too. But I always liked the ornamental stuff better, the flowers, the landscaping, all of that.
Awesome. So you get your MPA from USC, and then where did you go from there?
So when I when I went to USC, it was partly because they were offering a fellowship that was meant for someone taking public policy, the public policy degree, the Master of Public Policy. And at the time, being a naive kid, I didn't even really understand the difference between administration and policy. And I wanted to stay in the MPA because I thought it was more employable. I thought maybe someday I'd become a city manager or something like that. And they said, well, take your electives in policy and we can give you this scholarship. So I did that, and then they had a Sacramento Center for policy and administration students, and I went there for my last semester because it was closer to where I grew up. And I thought, you know, when I step off into my career, I can more readily afford a home and things like that in Northern California. It's just so expensive in Southern Cal. And so I was married. We went up to Sacramento, and it was closer to my family, still far away from hers. But I ended up getting an internship offer from the Taxpayers Association in Sacramento, and also one from the League of Cities. And I wanted to do the League of Cities one, but the taxpayers was paying more, and I was a poor, starving student, desperate for money. And so I went there. It was a more conservative organization than I am. I'm real dead center. I'm a political moderate. But it still was fun. I got the chance, besides doing research work, to lobby the legislature and to get to know elected officials. And the people that I worked with in the association were just fantastic. There was great leadership there, just a real sense of common goals and camaraderie. So I enjoyed it, and I ended up staying a decade. I didn't think I would stay that long, but they just kind of wrapped me in, and it turned into a long-term thing.
So what kind of leaders or have for mentors, and because you worked with a lot of political leaders, a lot of business leaders, what kind of experience did you have there that impacted your career?
I think I've been able to observe a lot of different leadership styles, and sometimes people that are in a position of leadership that maybe aren't really leaders at all. And politics can be that way, where working with politicians, with elected officials, as I have now for 26 years, you find ego drives a lot of things in politics, right? You've got to have a pretty strong ego to be able to withstand the burdens of campaigning and putting yourself out there. And ego doesn't always make for good leadership. If it's contained and controlled well, it can make for good leadership. But so I've seen some examples of both sides of the coin, I guess, and all of you have too. You've probably experienced a lot already in your careers as you have come before you came back into this program. But I would say that the leader that I worked under at the Taxpayers Association really embodied some things that I've tried to do as a leader. And I was just thinking about it last night, because Zonda had asked me questions about what leadership means to me. And I think what agrees with my philosophy the most is what Jim Collins wrote about in Good to Great. How many of you have read Good to Great? One of those classic management books, right? But he talks about a level 5 leader, and a lot of it is humility. And so they're driven, but they're driven for the organization's success rather than being the one who's on the pedestal in the spotlight. And when things go wrong, they accept blame for what goes wrong. When things go right, they spread the credit for what goes right to their team. And I had a leader like that in the president of the Taxpayers Association, and he was a great role model.
Awesome. So 10 years you were there?
I was there 10 years. Yeah, 1990 to about 2000.
And in 2000, you moved here.
There was a year in between where I went to work for a consulting firm in Sacramento that was working for state agencies largely on technology projects.
And so when you were with the Taxpayers Association, you were doing research, you were lobbying, you worked, as you mentioned, with political leaders. Did you work with business leaders a lot there as well?
Yeah, the organization was supported by the business community, and a lot of taxpayers associations are. So when you think taxpayer, you probably think just regular folks paying their taxes, but most taxpayers associations are really business organizations. And the California one was supported by very large businesses and some medium-sized ones, but generally the larger ones. Companies like Apple and Hewlett-Packard and Chevron and Exxon and all of those.
And so what benefit did you provide for those organizations?
Well, what I was providing was analysis and research on things like economic data, economic trends, tax burden, the impact of various tax changes. And then I was their lobbyist. We had a team of lobbyists, and our 2 vice presidents, interestingly enough, both of them had majored in German in college, and Carol and Rebecca, and they were just fantastic lobbyists on tax issues. And you wouldn't expect that from their background, but through various experiences in working either on the one hand for agencies, on the one hand for some elected officials, they gained some experience in tax policy and were just fantastic lobbyists. And they would handle some of the other issues while I handled local government, property tax, and some economic issues and things like that. But as someone who was, we actually had, one of the vice presidents was actually quite liberal. I was the moderate there. The others were fairly conservative. But because I was one of their political moderates, I was the guy that they would send out to negotiate with the teachers union or the public employee unions or the people who were interested in raising taxes to fund important things in education and in state government and local government. And I was the one to try to reach consensus with them. It wasn't always possible, but I enjoyed that role of being one that they felt that they could talk to who wasn't going to be hardline, anti everything they wanted. Interesting.
So what brought you to the Utah Foundation?
I knew Utah Foundation from my work in California, and the taxpayers group was small. It was 11 or 12 people. Utah Foundation right now is 6 people. We're fairly small. We have been smaller in the past, and fortunately I've been able to grow it a little bit in recent years. But we belong to a couple of associations nationally, and one of them was the Governmental Research Association. It's about 100 years old, and it's a loose network of organizations that do research on taxes and economic issues and things like that. And through that association, I got to know the director of Utah Foundation. He now runs the Legislative Office of Research and General Counsel, Mike Christensen, and we became friends. And what brought me to Utah actually was a phone call from the Taxpayers Association here asking if I wanted to come work here. And I said, no, I've already done the taxpayers thing. I want to do something different. And in that conversation, he mentioned that Utah Foundation was looking for a new leader. And so I thought it was a long shot, but I threw my hat into the ring and it worked out.
So what does the Utah Foundation do?
We are a public policy research organization, a think tank, if you will, but different than some of the think tanks you might think about if you're familiar with the term. If you think about Washington, D.C., and you've got groups like, on the right, you've got the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute, and on the left, you've got the Economic Policy Institute and sometimes Brookings and so on. We try to be more like the Pew Centers for Research, which is more of a middle-of-the-road, less political organization. And we're really proud of our nonpartisan heritage. The foundation's been around for 70 years. We just celebrated that big anniversary last fall. And it was started by business leaders back in 1945, right after World War II. And they were concerned about some really important things at the time, like the economy in Utah. I don't know if you know, but it had grown tremendously during World War II. There was a lot of work that came to Utah. Geneva Steel was created. A whole bunch of things were going on related to the wartime economy. And they were worried about a big crash, another depression. They wanted an independent organization that could study taxes and the economy and help legislators make some decisions on what to do. But help them in a sense of not being a lobbyist, but a data provider, a research provider. And we've carried that mission on through the years to cover things more than just taxes and the economy. We do a lot on education and on other programs that are important to the Utah residents and voters. And we're now a blend where we still have a core of support from the corporate community, but we also, and you can see the logos on that sheet that I passed around and the list of names, there are public sector entities involved too, and there are some big philanthropic foundations like Eccles and Sorensen that are giving. And so we're this interesting blend of institutions and companies that care about the quality of life and the economy.
So how do you decide? Like, I've read a lot of your research. You've done some fantastic research on education, on the wilderness, on land issues in Utah. How do you decide what to research?
Well, this is something interesting because this was one of the examples of an important change that I made when I came here. It had been a very small staff, 3 people when I got here, and the staff decided what they were going to research, and they had one board meeting a year. One. And at that meeting, they would just tell all the board members what they did and just celebrate what they did for the year. And I thought, okay, first of all, I'm a newcomer to Utah. I was here in college, but how many out-of-state college students really pay attention to the society and economy in the state? And so I thought, first of all, I need to rely on these people. And I've got some really high-level people on the board as well as some mid-level people, but people like the chairman of Zions Bank, people that are tied into the economy and know it really well. And I thought, I've got to take their guidance on what the research agenda should be. Plus, I want them to feel engaged on what we're doing. And as a leader of a nonprofit, I know that if they don't feel engaged, they won't continue contributing for very long. So what we've done ever since then is we take some ideas to the board and we ask them to consider a whole long list of ideas that we've gathered as staff from talking to legislators, city council members, county commissioners, people in the news media, people at the United Way and other nonprofits, the chambers and so on, and things that we've gathered from the news. We come up with a list of potential projects and then we let the board decide what we should pursue. Now we're really careful about that, and we give them some important instructions that they don't get to decide what the conclusion is of the research. It needs to be our professional opinion about what the data says, but they do get to set the agenda.
Okay. So as a business leader in the state of Utah, why would, say I'm the head of Instructure, why would I care about your research? And why would I want to access it, or how would I access it? Why would it be important to me?
Well, it takes a long-term view. And our mission is about promoting a thriving economy, a well-prepared workforce, and a high quality of life. You can fit a lot of things into those three phrases, right? But what I'm trying to sell, and honestly, I have to be a salesman. I'm the chief fundraiser of the organization. So when I'm going out and meeting with someone in business, I'm trying to sell them on the idea that you invest in this research and in the long run, our economy will do better, our workforce will be more prepared, and we'll keep our high quality of life, or we'll improve it where it needs improvement. And in doing that, I show them examples of the work that we do. We've done research on air quality that helps people understand what are the causes of the air quality problems that we just had last week for so long. This has been a bad year. What are some of the things that can be done about it? What are some changes already coming in public policy, like the EPA's rules on emissions from cars that are really going to clean up cars in the next 10 years? All kinds of things like that. We write about education because that matters so much for the workforce. We show them the reports. We show them how the news covers our work, how legislators are paying attention to the work, and that even as a non-advocacy organization, we're influencing the public dialogue. But they have to have a sense of, I'm in this for the long run, I'm willing to invest in this because I think that it helps Utah in the long run. They also appreciate the exposure that they get. We have that sheet of logos that I passed around where we trumpet who our major donors are. We, on all of our reports that we publish, the back page has the same list but without the logos. And we let people know every way that we can that we've got these major investors in the foundation, and they get a little bit of public goodwill for that. But I read things about what's going on in the nonprofit world, and one of the things people have been talking about for more than a decade is that the good corporate citizen is dead. It's not really. I mean, one of the examples that you can read about is, take this example from Tucson where Raytheon, a defense firm, used to give money to the opera, and they stopped giving money to the opera, but they still gave money in the community, but it was for a scholarship program at the University of Arizona for engineers. It was still a nonprofit donation, it was still tax deductible, but it's to create engineers that they need. There's no guarantee that they'll get those engineers, but they've got a supply that they can compete for. A lot of companies are interested in that, but we found that they're still interested in supporting this investment in long-run prosperity or quality of life. And so I don't think good corporate citizenship is dead. I think they do care about these things, but sometimes it's a harder sell with some companies than others.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting and helpful. Is your research available, free access to everyone? You don't charge for the results?
So we thought about that at some point. About 10 years ago, as we were struggling a little bit financially, we thought, well, the people who are members of the foundation need some sort of benefit for being members. And we've sort of realized after that, we can give them publicity, we can give them that, but the real hard benefits don't really work all that well for what we do. But we thought about it for a while that our executive summary would be available on our website to the public, but the full report would only be available to members who had a login and everything. It didn't work. So right now we have about 7,000 copies of our reports per month that are viewed on our website at utahfoundation.org, and it's free to the public. At the time it was less than that, several thousand, but the readership went down to almost zero when we required a password, because nobody could remember their password.
Yeah.
And our audience for the work is really the general public and the news media and elected officials, where the funders of the work, honestly, they're not necessarily reading every report. We're really proud when we have some board members who read everything we put out. But you're busy. How many emails do you get that you actually read? Or how many paper copies land in your inbox that you actually read? So they'll pick and choose. If a member has a certain interest in education, they'll read those reports. So we decided that because our mission is to serve the public, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, the information has to go out to the public free of charge, and that's what the members are underwriting. It's a public service to everybody else.
Okay, that's awesome. And it is really fascinating. I've been able to go on and read the things that I'm interested in. There's a lot of very interesting information about education, public education in Utah, that's fascinating. Another topic that I would like to touch on is your personal public service. You've never run for office. You've said you're a political moderate, but having known you for years, and you have twin daughters, you have what some would consider a large family, and you're really involved with your children. And speaking of gardening, for years, living down the street from me, you had the most awesome yard and garden on the lot in the neighborhood. You're a really busy person, but you have served many, many hours, and you still do, volunteer work on a lot of boards. And to name a few, Utah Economic Council, Salt Lake Chamber Board of Governors, the Utah Valley Chamber of Commerce Board of Governors, the Governor's Commission on Education Excellence, Prosperity 2020 Founders Council, and for several years that we were neighbors, you were also on the Planning Commission for the city that we lived in, and National Governmental Research Association. So, couple of questions. First, how did you find time to do that while you were growing a business and very involved with your family and also growing this amazing garden? And second question, how did you, and I think this is probably interesting to people that I know here in our class, we're getting close to graduating and probably thinking about how can we give back to our communities. How did you get on these boards? What's the path to service in communities, in serving in volunteer organizations? Did you have a strategy for pursuing these types of service opportunities?
I think I mostly winged it. But that's a lot of questions. So let me
I know, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk.
First of all, the gardening thing. If you're involved in a job for 40 to 50 hours a week, or whatever it is that you work, I work 40 to 45 hours a week. I've never been one to kill myself. If I can get it done, I get it done. But if you're working in a job where it's mostly about brain work, it's mostly about your intellectual exercise and all of that, there is something, at least in me, that needs to create something. There's something that needs physical, tangible stuff. I need my hands in the dirt. I need my hands on a piece of wood on a table saw. I need things like that to feel like I've actually created something besides just a bunch of ideas that are floating out there that may or may not be appreciated by somebody. And so I've had a strong desire for physical hobbies, and that includes sports type stuff too, like hiking and mountain biking and all, but creating real stuff that I can hold on to and see. And so that's been important to me, and it just had to fit in my life, or else I would have been driven crazy. So I didn't actually come back to my gardening hobby that I learned as a kid until I owned my first home, which was a condo townhouse with 2 little strips of dirt in the front courtyard. And I probably planted 100 flowers in those 2 little strips of dirt, plus a tree and 2 vines and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I just realized at that moment how much I had been hungering to get back to the soil. But as far as community groups, some of it's not as altruistic as it might seem. I mean, to sit on a Chamber of Commerce board is a fantastic networking opportunity. So as someone who needs to depend on the goodwill of people in business to support my organization, over time, as I sit on these chamber boards, I get to know people in business. And you can't be crass about it and just hit somebody up for money when you first meet them. But as you've known somebody for a couple years, as you sit on a board with them or something, and the chamber board is huge. The Salt Lake Chamber Board is about 120 people. As you've known people for a few years, you'll eventually go to lunch with them, you'll eventually talk about the work you do, and then maybe there's an opening to talk about maybe they should be helping out at the foundation, and maybe they could be on my board. And a lot of people are really open to that once they know you. So it's also a way, though, to be in touch with the issues and to know, the chamber is very much involved in education policy right now. Part of that I feel happy about because I was able to influence it, because I've been working with the chamber for a number of years and pushing on them a bit to pay attention to education and to start advocating for improvement. And they created Prosperity 2020 and Education First, which is a political action committee. And it's not just because I asked them to consider it, but it's because other people were asking them too, but I was a little part of that. When it comes to like the Planning Commission, I was actually shocked because in California, if you're in any decent sized city and you want to get involved in city politics, you have to start with a volunteer commission or committee, and then you work your way into being known in the city, and then you can run for city council or something like that. And you can't get on the Planning Commission in a California city unless you know people, unless you're friends with half the city council or something like that. It's a plum position because they know that the commissioners are someday going to run against them for city council. And I got this newsletter from the city saying, hey, we really need another planning commissioner. Won't somebody apply? And I thought, oh my gosh, I can be on the Planning Commission and I don't even have to know everybody. And so I just applied and they let me in. And within 4 months, the chairman quit and they made me the chairman. And in that process, I handled the very contentious decision on a Walmart coming to town and enforcing some design guidelines that actually made it the prettiest Walmart in the whole country, probably. And having a bunch of residents mad at me for the fact that that large parcel that had been zoned commercial that they bought a house next to was actually going to have something commercial on it. And I say that sarcastically, but sorry. But anyway, when you buy a house, look at the zoning maps. They're online now. If they're not online, go to city office and find out what's zoned for that empty parcel next to your house, because you can't change the zoning generally once you just buy a house. But anyway, through that process, was really happy to be involved in helping to be part of the team that shaped some city policies. The Governor's Commission on Education is actually something of an interesting story itself, because I really had to work to get on that one. Utah Foundation does so much on education. I thought it was a natural fit for us to have some representation on that committee. But I made a mistake. At one of the first meetings of the commission, I was invited as a guest. And the governor attends these meetings. And the governor and I were friends when he was a county commissioner in Utah County. And he was one of the first politicians I had lunch with when I moved here. When he was lieutenant governor, we continued being friends. And we would talk about issues frequently. So as governor, as a fairly new governor, he created this education commission, invited me to come speak about education funding. And I talked about how the effort for funding schools has been falling off in the last 20 years. And he mentioned that this is probably because of our public lands. And because we don't have control of our public lands, we can't generate enough money. I disagreed with him. And I said something that was interpreted as a snarky disagreement, and it wasn't really meant that way. But for a couple of years after, I was sort of shut out from the good graces of our governor, and because it looked like I was mocking him in front of people, and I really didn't mean it that way. Eventually, I asked enough powerful people to ask him to put me on the commission that he finally relented and gave me a phone call and said, yeah, we can disagree, but you know you're usually wrong when we disagree. And I said, sure, I probably am. So anyway.
Well, I think in order to have some time for Q&A,
okay,
we probably should wrap it up. So is there any lesson learned that you would like to share with us before we go to Q&A? Or most interesting research that you found, or anything you
Most
really like to
interesting
share?
research. Oh, we do so much cool research that it's hard to pin
Okay.
down one. I'd say most recently, we did a survey last year. It's a 4-part release that you'll see on our website called Millennials and Boomers. And it was a survey that we did of all the generations in Utah, but we called it Millennials and Boomers for a catchy title. And asking them questions about what they want to enhance their quality of life, what kind of city they want to live in, all these interesting things. And I can't say that there's one thing that really stands out in that. We all know Utah is unique, and so some of the uniqueness showed up. For example, the idea that millennials want to live in big city high-rise apartments, not in the suburbs. It's sort of true in Utah, but less true than in the rest of the country. There's more of a preference than in older generations, but it's the fact that Utahns marry younger and have kids younger means that they are more interested in suburban living. And, but there's all kinds of interesting stuff in there. We've had forums at Weber State. We're going to do some at other colleges to talk. We get elected officials to come talk to students about how they can create the world that they want to create, or the state that they want to create in terms of public policy. I like that because it leads to all this follow-up work in getting people together to talk about the issues.
Cool. Okay, we do have a few minutes for Q&A. Yes.
I live in Alpine School District, and there's a very strong anti-core, Common Core group, not just in our district, but throughout the state, especially Davis districts. I don't know what your opinion, is it this big evil thing from the federal government? Is it just raising the bar? What is your opinion from your research?
I'd say on balance, they've been pretty good. And there have been some mistakes made by the federal government because education is a local responsibility. Nobody at the state level really likes the federal government telling them how it must be done. But sometimes the federal government has to tell states how to do it. When it comes to discrimination against poor black kids in the South, for example, and things like that, the federal government has to step in. But when it comes to the standards of what we're teaching kids, states have developed those on their own, and some states didn't even have standards. Utah was used to standards. We developed them in the 90s, and the Common Core did elevate our standards. It raised them to a little more rigorous level. One of the things we're seeing right now, and I've asked some education officials, including the current interim superintendent, why this has happened, but one of the things we're seeing is our ranking in the national test scores is going up. And we've been drawing attention to the fact that the ranking went down in the 2000s, because in the 90s we were one of the top 15 states. We were doing pretty well. In the 2000s we fell quite a bit, down to about the average state. And if you look at peer states, states that are like us economically and demographically and in terms of the education level of parents, we were last among the peer states. And now we're climbing again. So one of the theories is, did we implement Common Core better than other states? And is that why we're going up? Because some of the other states have actually gone down, and that's one reason why our rank has gone up, even if we've held steady. And it does seem that we've implemented it better than some of the other states, and it's because we were already used to standards. So it doesn't appear to have hurt us, but I also understand the idea that people don't want the federal government intruding too much on a state and school district responsibility. So as long as these are voluntary standards that the federal government has proposed and states can adopt, that's fine. But there have been a couple of steps by the federal education department that made them seem like less than voluntary. For example, if you wanted a chance at the big Race to the Top grant program, you had to adopt the Common Core. That was an incentive. It wasn't forcing the states to do it, but most of the states did it in order to try to get some of the Race to the Top money. Maybe in some of those efforts, the federal government looked like they were pushing it more than a voluntary thing. But the governor appointed a commission, a small group, which included the Attorney General, to decide, to look deeply at this and say, have these been forced on us, or was it voluntary? And they decided it was voluntary. We could leave the Common Core at any time we want. So I think that's pretty clear, but it doesn't satisfy the people who really are angry at the federal government for a whole range of issues and don't want them intruding on what the state does.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
So much.
It's fun.